The most dangerous person in the room is usually the one nobody notices. The creature stood nearly 12 feet tall beneath the shimmering lights of the diplomatic pavilion, its armored body casting a shadow across polished metal floors as alarms echoed through the structure. Delegates from dozens of worlds backed away in panic. Security personnel shouted conflicting instructions into their communicators. Holographic displays flickered red across the ceiling. Beyond the transparent walls of the pavilion, a violent electrical storm rolled across the surface of Vera Prime, painting the sky in flashes of blue and silver. In the middle of the chaos, one man remained perfectly still. Jackson Cole stood beside the primary exit with his hands folded behind his back. His black diplomatic security uniform showed no sign of urgency, no sign of fear, no sign of surprise. At 39 years old, the human bodyguard looked almost bored. Rain hammered the glass overhead. The creature emitted another deep mechanical growl that vibrated through the floor. Several alien officials stumbled backward. One dropped a data tablet. Another nearly collided with a serving drone while trying to retreat. Yet Jackson did not move. His gray eyes simply followed the situation with quiet attention. Ambassador Selene Vala noticed immediately. The sapphire-skinned diplomat stood near the central negotiation platform surrounded by nervous advisors. Her golden hair reflected the emergency lights as she stared at her bodyguard across the room. Even now, with tension spreading through the pavilion, his expression had not changed. That irritated her more than it probably should have. Everyone else looked concerned. Everyone else understood the seriousness of the situation. Jackson looked like he was waiting for a delayed train. Another warning siren sounded overhead. Security teams moved into position near the outer corridors. The towering creature shifted again, confused by the crowd, confused by the noise, confused by the flashing lights. Several delegates gasped. Jackson finally took one step forward, just one. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Yet something about the movement drew attention. The creature stopped. Its massive head turned slightly toward him. The room fell strangely quiet. Even the security officers seemed unsure what would happen next. Jackson studied the animal for several seconds. Then he glanced toward the nearest control technician. "Turn off the sirens," he said calmly. The technician blinked. "What?" "The sirens." His voice remained steady. "They are making the situation worse." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, unexpectedly, the creature lowered its head slightly. The aggressive posture vanished. Confusion replaced agitation. Several delegates exchanged stunned looks. Jackson nodded once. "Thank you." The technician hurried to disable the alarms. One by one, the warning signals disappeared. Silence returned to the pavilion. The creature remained still. The tension slowly dissolved. Across the room, Selene stared at the human bodyguard. For the first time that evening, she felt something unfamiliar. Not admiration, not respect, curiosity. Because while everyone else had reacted to the danger, Jackson had reacted to the cause. And somehow that bothered her. Moments later, diplomatic staff resumed their work. Security teams relaxed. The incident seemed over. Yet Selene continued watching the quiet human standing near the exit. She did not know his history. She did not know where he came from. She did not know why a simple bodyguard could remain calm while seasoned officials panicked. She only knew one thing. The man assigned to carry her luggage and stand silently behind her chair was beginning to look far more interesting than his personnel file suggested. 3 hours earlier, before the alarms, before the confused creature wandered into the pavilion, Ambassador Selene Vala had already decided she disliked her new bodyguard. The diplomatic transport descended through the storm clouds of Vera Prime with practiced precision, its silver hull cutting through sheets of rain while lightning flickered across the horizon. Inside the passenger compartment, senior advisors reviewed negotiation documents and trade projections. Holographic charts floated above polished tables. The atmosphere was tense, but professional. At the rear of the cabin stood Jackson Cole, motionless, silent, watching. Selene noticed him the moment he boarded. Most security personnel introduced themselves. Most attempted to impress their clients. Most, at least, acknowledged their existence. Jackson had done none of those things. He carried her luggage aboard, checked the exits, and then positioned himself near the rear bulkhead, as though he had become part of the ship itself. For nearly 2 hours, he barely spoke a dozen words. Celine finally closed her datapad and looked toward him. "Tell me something, Mr. Cole." Jackson raised his eyes. "Yes, Ambassador. Do all human bodyguards come with a personality suppression package?" Several advisors chuckled. Jackson simply looked at her. "Not all of them. You certainly did." More laughter followed. One of the junior diplomats covered a smile. Another shook his head. Celine leaned back in her chair. "I have worked with military escorts before. Most enjoy reminding everyone how important they are. I'm not important." The answer arrived instantly, calmly, as if it were an obvious fact. Celine raised an eyebrow. "That might be the first honest statement I have heard from security personnel." The diplomats laughed again. Jackson did not. He returned his attention to the storm visible through the viewport. That irritated her even more. Most people reacted when she teased them. Most defended themselves. Most wanted approval. Jackson appeared completely unaffected. The transport entered a turbulence pocket. The cabin shuddered slightly. Several passengers tightened their restraints. Jackson glanced toward the forward display. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Pilot should adjust 5 degrees starboard," he said. Nobody responded. The pilot continued along the programmed route. 20 seconds later, the ship encountered a stronger atmospheric disturbance. Warning indicators flashed briefly before stabilizing. Several passengers looked around nervously. The pilot adjusted course, exactly 5 degrees starboard. Celine noticed. So did 2 of her advisors. "Lucky guess," one of them said. Jackson offered no response. The remainder of the descent passed quietly. After landing, the diplomatic convoy moved through the capital city beneath towering crystal structures and elevated transit lanes. Rain continued falling. Lightning illuminated distant mountains beyond the city. Throughout the journey, Jackson remained silent, observing, listening, watching entrances, exits, rooftops, and crowds with the same expressionless focus. By the time they reached the pavilion, Celine had reached a conclusion. The human was competent enough, but dull, predictable, entirely unremarkable. She shared the opinion during a private conversation with her chief aide. "He barely speaks. Perhaps that is professionalism. Perhaps it is boredom." Her aide smiled politely. "He came highly recommended." Then whoever recommended him has very low standards. Neither of them noticed Jackson standing 20 feet away near the entrance corridor. He gave no indication he had heard the conversation. No reaction. No annoyance. No defense. He simply continued watching the room. Looking back later, Celine would remember that moment with considerable embarrassment, because she had spent the entire afternoon assuming she understood the quiet human standing behind her chair, and she was completely wrong. The negotiations began shortly after sunset. Rain drummed steadily against the transparent dome of the diplomatic pavilion, while representatives from 14 worlds gathered around a circular conference platform. Soft blue lighting reflected across polished floors. Translation systems whispered dozens of languages into discrete earpieces. The atmosphere appeared calm, professional, predictable, yet Jackson Cole seemed increasingly interested in everything except the negotiations. Celine noticed it almost immediately. While diplomats debated trade routes and customs regulations, her bodyguard kept glancing toward the upper maintenance walkways near the ceiling. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the Eastern Service Corridor, then toward the weather monitors, then back again. It was subtle. Most people would never have noticed. Celine did. "Is something wrong?" she asked quietly during a scheduled recess. Jackson looked at her. "No, Ambassador. You have checked the same corridor 7 times. 8. Celine blinked. "That is not reassuring." "It was not intended to be. Before she could respond, Jackson turned his attention back toward the room. The answer irritated her. Again, he never explained anything, never elaborated, never volunteered information unless absolutely necessary. Across the pavilion, servers moved between tables carrying refreshments. Delegates exchanged polite conversation. Advisors reviewed reports. Everything appeared perfectly normal, yet Jackson continued watching the room as if waiting for something. An hour later, Celine began noticing small things herself. A security officer entered through the western entrance and quietly spoke with another officer. Both immediately looked toward the weather monitors. A maintenance drone crossed the ceiling and stopped unexpectedly near an air filtration vent. The electrical storm outside intensified. Lightning flashed across the clouds often enough to turn the glass walls silver every few seconds. Jackson watched all of it. "You keep staring at the weather displays," Celine said. "Yes." "Why?" He hesitated. "Just briefly. Patterns." "What patterns?" "The wrong ones." The answer made no sense. Before she could ask another question, a senior delegate approached to discuss negotiation strategy. The conversation moved on. Yet the phrase lingered in her mind. The wrong ones. Several hours later, the negotiations entered their final session. Exhaustion settled over the room. Coffee cups accumulated beside data pads. Advisors rubbed tired eyes. Even Celine felt the strain. Only Jackson appeared exactly as he had that morning. Calm, alert, unchanged. Then something happened. A soft warning chime sounded from a nearby environmental monitor. Most people ignored it. Jackson did not. His eyes immediately locked onto the display. Numbers scrolled across the screen. Atmosphere pressure, electrical activity, structural sensor data. Nothing alarming, at least not to Celine. Jackson stepped closer, studied the readings, then looked toward the Eastern Service Corridor again. "Ambassador." His voice was quiet, serious. "I think we should leave this room." Celine stared at him. "Now?" "Yes." "Why?" Jackson's eyes never left the corridor. "Because whatever is about to happen is arriving 3 minutes earlier than I expected." Celine stared at him for several seconds. Around them, diplomats continued their conversations, completely unaware that anything was wrong. The storm outside flashed across the transparent dome, bathing the pavilion in silver light. 3 minutes until what?" she asked. Jackson did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the eastern corridor. "I'm not sure." That was somehow less comforting than any other answer he could have given. "You want me to leave a diplomatic summit because you are not sure?" "Yes." The response came without hesitation. Celine folded her arms. "That may be the least convincing argument I have heard all week." Jackson finally looked at her. His expression remained calm, but something had changed. The casual silence she had mistaken for indifference was gone. What remained was focus. Absolute focus. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "please trust me." Before she could reply, the environmental monitor chimed again. This time, several delegates noticed. A technician frowned at his console. Another warning appeared beside the weather data, then another. The pavilion lights flickered once. Conversation slowed. Jackson moved immediately, not quickly, not dramatically, efficiently. He stepped toward the central control station and examined a nearby display. Numbers streamed across the screen. Pressure readings, power fluctuations, sensor interference. The technician looked confused. That should not be happening. Jackson nodded slightly. "I know." The technician stared at him. "How?" Jackson ignored the question. Across the room, security personnel began checking their communicators. Static interrupted several channels. The interference grew stronger with every passing second. Outside, the electrical storm intensified. Lightning rolled across the sky so frequently that darkness barely existed between flashes. Then came the sound. A deep, metallic groan somewhere above the dome. subtle, easy to miss. Jackson heard it immediately. So did the maintenance engineer monitoring the structural systems. The engineer's face went pale. That is impossible. Celine looked up. What is? The engineer swallowed hard. Something is moving through the upper service network. The room fell silent. Delegates exchanged nervous glances. Security teams shifted position. Jackson was already walking toward the nearest emergency exit. Now, he said, we leave now. For the first time that evening, nobody argued. A vibration traveled through the floor beneath their feet. Not violent, not dangerous. Just enough to feel. Several glasses rattled on nearby tables. Another warning alarm activated. Then another. The pavilion's central system automatically highlighted a section of the ceiling. Maintenance pathways, ventilation routes, structural access tunnels. Something large was moving through them. The tracking display struggled to identify it. Security breach, one official asked. Unknown, replied a technician. Mechanical failure? Unknown. Wildlife? Unknown. The uncertainty spread through the room faster than fear. Jackson reached Celine's side. Ambassador. She looked at him. You expected this? Part of it. How? Lightning illuminated the pavilion again. For a brief moment, Jackson's eyes reflected the glow of dozens of warning displays. Because storms make people watch the sky, he said, and anything intelligent uses that distraction. Before Celine could process the statement, a new alert appeared across every screen in the pavilion simultaneously. Unauthorized access detected. Multiple systems compromised. The message repeated in 6 languages. Around them, diplomats froze. Security officers moved toward defensive positions. Nobody seemed to understand what was happening. Nobody except Jackson. Because while everyone else was staring at the warning messages, he was watching the corridor where it all began. And when he saw the service door slowly start to open by itself, his expression did something Celine had never seen before. It hardened. The service door slid open with agonizing slowness. Every eye in the pavilion turned toward it. Rain hammered against the dome overhead. Warning messages continued flashing across suspended displays. Yet, nothing emerged from the corridor, at least not at first. The empty doorway somehow felt worse. Security officers raised scanning devices. Technicians checked sensor feeds. Delegates whispered nervously among themselves. Jackson remained motionless beside Celine. His attention never left the corridor. Do you know what is in there? Celine asked quietly. No. You seem remarkably calm for someone who keeps predicting things. Prediction is easier than certainty. The answer made little sense. Then, a maintenance drone drifted through the doorway. Several officials released nervous breaths. The small machine floated forward, carrying diagnostic equipment beneath its chassis. That is it, one diplomat asked. A maintenance drone? Laughter spread uneasily through the room. Even some security officers relaxed. The tension began to fade. Jackson did not. The drone moved another 20 FT into the pavilion. Then, it stopped. Not because it reached its destination, because it appeared confused. Its navigation lights flickered. The machine rotated slightly, then again. The technician monitoring the drone frowned. That is strange. Jackson immediately stepped forward. What is strange? The technician pointed at a screen. Its navigation system cannot find reference points. How? I do not know. More drones suddenly appeared in the corridor, then more. 5, 10, 15. Small maintenance units drifted into the pavilion in complete silence. Delegates backed away. Security officers exchanged uncertain looks. None of the drones displayed aggressive behavior. They simply hovered, watching, scanning, searching. System interference, one technician muttered. It has to be. Jackson studied the machines carefully. Then his eyes moved toward the ceiling. No, the technician asked. They are responding to something. Another lightning flash illuminated the dome. For a brief second, reflections covered every surface in silver light. Jackson noticed something hidden among those reflections. His expression sharpened immediately. "Ambassador," Celine turned toward him. "What now?" "Look at the Western support column." She followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed a faint shimmer running across the metal surface. Not light, not rain, movement, tiny movements, thousands of them. The technician nearest the column stared at his scanner. His eyes widened. "That cannot be right." "What?" asked another official. "The entire structural network is full of micro-maintenance units." Confused murmurs spread through the room. The pavilion contained millions of microscopic repair machines. Every modern structure did. They repaired cracks, monitored stress points, and maintained environmental systems. They were harmless, essential, invisible. "Why is that a problem?" someone asked. Jackson answered before the technician could. "Because they are all moving toward the same location." The room fell silent again. Every display suddenly updated. New sensor readings appeared. Millions of tiny machines converging through walls, ceilings, support columns, and maintenance channels. All heading toward the central pavilion. Nobody understood why. Nobody except Jackson. "The storm," he said quietly. "The interference." Celine frowned. "What about it?" Jackson looked toward the ceiling. Someone used the electrical activity to hide a command signal. The realization spread slowly across the room. Whatever was happening had never been an accident. It had never been wildlife. It had never been a structural failure. Someone had deliberately taken control of the pavilion's infrastructure. Then every drone in the room abruptly turned in exactly the same direction, toward the diplomatic conference table. And for the first time all evening, Jackson looked genuinely concerned. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Hundreds of tiny machines hovered silently throughout the pavilion, all facing the same direction. The conference table sat at the center of the room beneath a circle of suspended lights. At first glance, it appeared completely ordinary. Polished surface, embedded displays, translation systems. Nothing unusual. Yet every drone, every sensor, and apparently millions of microscopic maintenance units hidden throughout the structure had focused their attention on that single location. Jackson moved first. He walked toward the table with measured steps while security officers hesitated behind him. "Mr. Cole," Celine called, "do not touch anything." "I am not planning to." His eyes swept across the table surface. Every detail seemed to matter. The placement of data pads, the arrangement of projectors, the power connections beneath the floor. Around him, technicians rushed to their consoles. Streams of diagnostic information filled holographic displays. The storm outside continued battering the dome. Lightning flashed across the sky. Thunder rolled through the mountains surrounding the city. Yet inside the pavilion, another pattern had begun to emerge. "I found the signal source," one technician announced. Everyone turned toward him. "Where?" asked a security officer. The technician swallowed. "That is the problem." "What problem?" "The source keeps moving." Murmurs spread through the room. Jackson nodded slightly as if the answer confirmed something he already suspected. Celine noticed immediately. "You expected that too?" "Yes." "How?" Jackson crouched beside the conference table and examined a maintenance access panel beneath the structure. "Because fixed targets are easy to find." The panel slid open. Several technicians leaned forward. Inside was a dense cluster of communication hardware connected to the pavilion's primary systems. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing appeared altered. Yet Jackson stared at it for several seconds before reaching toward one specific component. "This does not belong here." The nearest engineer frowned. "Of course it does." Jackson pointed toward a small metallic device no larger than a coin. "No." The engineer looked closer. Then his expression changed. "I have never seen that module before." Suddenly, the entire room became very interested. Security officers moved closer. Technicians expanded sensor scans. Data flooded across the displays. The tiny device sat quietly among thousands of legitimate components. hidden in plain sight. "What is it?" Celine asked. The engineer adjusted his scanner. "Unknown manufacturer. Unknown function?" "Not exactly." He stared at the results appearing across his screen. "It is a relay." Jackson stood. "A relay for what?" The engineer's eyes widened. "Everything." Silence followed. The tiny object was connected to communication systems, environmental controls, maintenance networks, security monitoring equipment, and structural management software. It touched nearly every major system inside the pavilion. "Someone built a back door into the entire facility," a technician whispered. "Years ago." Celine felt a chill. The negotiations had been planned for months. The pavilion itself had been considered one of the most secure diplomatic locations in the sector. Yet someone had hidden a device at the heart of the structure and waited patiently for the right moment to activate it. "Can you identify who installed it?" asked the security officer. The engineer shook his head. "No records exist." Jackson looked toward the storm beyond the glass dome. His expression remained calm, but his eyes had narrowed again. He seemed less surprised than everyone else. "Mr. Cole," Celine said quietly, "you recognize the signs before anyone else." "What?" Jackson did not answer immediately. Another lightning flash illuminated the pavilion. The silver light reflected in his gray eyes. Finally, he spoke. "Because I have seen this before." The room fell silent. "Where?" Celine asked. Jackson looked at the hidden relay device, then at the thousands of drones hovering motionless around the room. His answer came softly. "On a world where entire cities disappeared because people ignored small warnings." The room remained silent long after Jackson spoke. On a world where entire cities disappeared because people ignored small warnings. The statement hung in the air like another storm cloud. Technicians exchanged uncertain glances. Security officers looked at the human bodyguard with new interest. Celine studied him carefully. Until now, she had viewed him as a competent but unremarkable escort. A quiet professional assigned to stand near doors and watch hallways. Yet, every hour seemed to reveal another layer she had never suspected existed. "What world?" one officer finally asked. Jackson looked away from the relay device. "A long time ago." The answer frustrated everyone equally, especially Celine. "That is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting right now." Before she could challenge him further, every holographic display in the pavilion suddenly flickered. Data streams froze. Security feeds vanished. Environmental. Readings disappeared from the screens. The technicians reacted immediately. Fingers moved across control panels. Diagnostics flooded the system. Nothing responded correctly. "We lost external network access," one technician announced. "All of it?" "Yes." Another technician looked up from his console. "The relay is broadcasting again." Jackson stepped toward the display. "To where?" "I cannot tell." The technician sounded increasingly uncomfortable. "The destination is hidden." Rain battered the dome overhead. Lightning flashed across the sky. Hundreds of maintenance drones remained suspended around the conference chamber like frozen insects. Nobody trusted the silence anymore. Every sound felt important. Every shadow demanded attention. Then one of the junior analysts reviewing archival records suddenly stood up. "I found something." Every head turned. The analyst enlarged a file across the central display. A personnel database, military, restricted access. Several security officers frowned immediately. "How did you get into that system?" "The relay opened channels it should not have." His voice shook slightly. "Look at this." The screen filled with personnel records connected to previous infrastructure failures throughout the sector. Engineers, security consultants, communication specialists. Names, dates, assignments. At first the information seemed unrelated. Then the pattern emerged. Every incident involved the same investigation team. Every investigation ended without answers. Every report was quietly archived. "That cannot be a coincidence," Celine whispered. Jackson nodded once. It is not. The analyst continued searching. More files appeared, more sealed reports, more hidden records. Then the room went completely still. One name appeared again and again throughout the investigations. A senior intelligence official currently assigned to Interstellar diplomatic security, the same division responsible for protecting this summit, the same division responsible for approving Jackson's security clearance, the same division responsible for overseeing the pavilion. Somebody buried all of this, a security officer said quietly, for years. Nobody disagreed. Celine stared at the screen. The conspiracy was no longer theoretical. It had a shape, a history, a trail stretching backward across multiple worlds. "How did you know?" she asked. Jackson looked at the records without surprise. "I did not." "Then why were you looking for it?" The storm flashed outside once more. White light filled the pavilion. Jackson folded his arms. "Because people do not spend years hiding small mistakes." The room fell silent again. Everyone understood the implication. Small mistakes get corrected. Small mistakes get forgotten. Only something important receives that level of protection. The analyst opened one final file. His eyes widened immediately. "You need to see this." The display shifted. A decades-old mission report appeared, officially classified. Most of the text was heavily restricted, but one section remained visible, a deployment roster. The room stared at the list, then stared at Jackson. Because among the names of decorated officers and survival specialists was one entry that changed everything. Jackson Cole, Deathworld Recon Division, survival rating 100%. And suddenly the quiet bodyguard standing near the conference table no longer seemed ordinary at all. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The storm outside continued to roar across the mountains of Vera Prime, but inside the pavilion, an entirely different shockwave had passed through the room. The personnel file remained suspended above the conference table. Deathworld Recon Division, survival rating 100%. Several diplomats stared at Jackson as if they were seeing him for the first time. In a way, they were. Celine looked from the file to the quiet human standing beside the damaged relay device. "That classification is real?" she asked. The analyst nodded slowly. "Very real." Another officer stepped closer to the display. "I have heard of Deathworld Recon." His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. "Most recruits never finish training. Most never apply," another officer replied. Jackson seemed entirely uninterested in the conversation. He continued examining the relay hidden beneath the conference table. The reaction around him might as well have been happening on another planet. That, more than the file itself, unsettled Celine.
If the information was as extraordinary as everyone believed, why did he not seem proud of it? Why did he not even acknowledge it? "You never mentioned any of this," she said. Jackson finally looked up. Nobody asked. Several people exchanged looks. The answer sounded absurdly simple, yet somehow it fit him perfectly. The analyst continued scrolling through restricted records. Additional mission summaries appeared across the display.
Most details remained sealed, but fragments were visible. Extreme environments, infrastructure collapses, evacuation operations, survival deployments measured in months instead of days. Celine noticed something unusual. The reports highlighted rescue statistics far more often than combat records. Wait. She leaned closer to the display. These operations were civilian evacuations. The analyst nodded. Most of them. Another file appeared, then another. Different worlds, different disasters, the same name. Jackson Cole, again and again. Not as an assault specialist, not as a tactical commander, as an extraction leader, a survival coordinator, someone assigned to bring people home. Celine slowly looked toward him. "You were not deployed to fight." Jackson shrugged. "Usually not." "Then why send Deathworld recon teams?" His eyes drifted briefly toward the storm beyond the dome. "Because some places become impossible to survive." The answer carried no drama, no pride, just fact. A deep silence settled over the pavilion. For the first time, Celine began to understand why his instincts seemed different from everyone else's, why he noticed details nobody saw, why he reacted to patterns before sensors detected them. He had spent years learning how small failures became catastrophes. Suddenly, a technician's voice broke the silence. I found the source command. Every head turned. Data flooded across the central displays. The relay beneath the conference table had finally revealed part of its transmission history. Thousands of commands, years of activity, hidden maintenance requests, altered inspections, manipulated diagnostics. The pattern stretched backward through nearly a decade of records. Someone has been using the pavilion as a testing ground, the technician whispered. Testing what? Asked Celine. The technician enlarged a final data cluster. His expression darkened. Automated infrastructure control. Jackson stood up immediately. How many connected systems? The technician checked the figures and went pale. Not just this pavilion. The room grew silent once again. Rain hammered against the dome. Lightning flashed across the sky. How many? Jackson repeated. The technician swallowed hard. 3 cities. For the first time that night, Jackson's calm expression disappeared completely. And somehow that frightened Celine more than anything else she had seen. For a moment, nobody moved. The storm outside seemed distant now, reduced to flashes of light beyond the dome. 3 cities. The number lingered over the room like a shadow. Technicians stared at their displays. Security officers exchanged uneasy looks. Diplomats who had arrived expecting trade negotiations now found themselves confronting something far larger than politics. Jackson stepped toward the central console. His expression had returned to calm, but Celine could tell the difference now. Before, she had mistaken his silence for indifference. Now she recognized it for what it was. Control. Can the network be shut down? He asked. The lead technician hesitated. Not safely. Why? Because whoever built it connected the system to essential infrastructure. Streams of data flowed across the displays. Transportation grids, environmental controls, communication relays, emergency response networks. The hidden architecture reached everywhere. If we disconnect it abruptly, the technician continued, we risk disabling systems millions of civilians rely on every day. A heavy silence followed. Jackson nodded slowly. He had already anticipated the answer. Then do not disconnect it. Several people looked at him in surprise. What? Asked a security officer. Trace it. Jackson pointed toward the relay device beneath the table. Whoever created this spent years hiding their work. People like that do not trust automation alone. Somewhere there is a command center. The technicians immediately began rerouting scans. New maps appeared across the displays. Lines of hidden communication traffic stretched through the city and beyond. The network suddenly looked less like a machine and more like a trail. I have it, one analyst announced. Signal convergence point located. A location marker appeared above the city, an abandoned communications facility on the outskirts of Vera Prime's capital region. The room erupted with conversation. Security teams began coordinating responses. Government officials contacted authorities. For the first time all night, momentum shifted in their favor. Celine watched Jackson quietly. He had predicted the danger, identified the pattern, found the relay, and now guided the response without seeking credit. It felt impossible to reconcile with the man she had mocked only hours earlier. Eventually, the security chief approached him. You should be leading this operation. Jackson shook his head. No. Why not? Because my job is protecting the ambassador. The answer was so simple that nobody argued. Several hours later, as dawn began to break beyond the mountains, confirmation finally arrived. The hidden network had been exposed. The command facility had been secured. Investigators were already reviewing years of concealed records. The threat was over. The pavilion gradually returned to normal. Emergency systems deactivated. Displays resumed ordinary functions. Outside, the storm finally began to fade. Golden sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time all night. Delegates prepared to leave. Technicians packed equipment. Security officers completed reports. Through it all, Jackson stood near the exit, exactly where he had stood at the beginning of the summit. Quiet. Unassuming. Almost invisible. Celine crossed the room and stopped beside him. "I owe you an apology." Jackson looked at her. "For what?" "For assuming I understood who you were." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first she had ever seen. "Most people do. And that does not bother you?" He looked toward the sunrise spilling across the city. "Not really." "Why?" Jackson considered the question for a moment. "Because what people think about me is not nearly as important as whether they get home safely." Celine followed his gaze. The first rays of sunlight reflected from distant towers and starships preparing for departure. Around them, the summit continued. Diplomats talked. Workers cleaned. Life moved forward. Yet something fundamental had changed. She had spent the entire day believing strength looked like authority, influence, and status. Then she met a quiet human who carried none of those things openly and possessed more strength than anyone in the room. The sunlight reflected in her violet eyes as Jackson turned toward the exit. He was still the same man who carried luggage, washed hallways, and spoke only when necessary. The difference was that now everyone else finally understood what he had always been. Not the most important person in the room, just the one who noticed danger first, acted when it mattered, and never needed recognition to do the right thing.